I was not diagnosed with schwannomatosis until the age of 30. Around the age of 25, I started having issues with my left leg. It would go out from underneath me. Went to an orthopedic surgeon who at that time performed an MRI, and that's when they found my first tumor. When I was first diagnosed, I had no clue what it was. I was in shock. I was concerned. I didn't know what the future held at that time because I was told it was a rare genetic disorder. And not knowing how many tumors I had, what I was going to go through, what type of surgery, what type of procedures that the doctors were going to have to perform.
It made it much tougher for her, there's no doubt. When you go through pain like she went through and is still going through, it's got to affect your life in all sorts of ways. And the saying, she is a fighter, she is. I mean, she's fought through a lot of pain and a lot of struggles, but she's still great.
She is passionate as anybody I've ever met. She cares about everybody she runs into who may have this disease, and that never give up attitude that she has, I think helps carry her a long ways with the difficulty she's dealing with.
I think it has inspired her to be more passionate about her life, about helping others, and being involved in the Children's Tumor Foundation. It's actually increased her awareness of suffering of other people.
To me, you have to look at a positive and the negative. And this genetic disorder is a negative, especially on the small children. But it's given me the opportunity to just really sit down with some of the younger individuals and say, hey, you are a fighter. You've got this. You can do this. And I am here to walk beside you and with you on this journey. My involvement with the NF Endurance team is because I am an active runner and because I'm very active in sports. I want to be able to put CTF's name out there and for people to say to me, what is the Children's Tumor Foundation? What is neurofibromatosis? I've had some amazing opportunities, like when I ran the Nashville half marathon, people coming up to me and asking me those questions, or meeting other individuals who are running for someone that has neurofibromatosis.
In so many ways, Michelle has impacted my life, and I see her impacting so many others' lives. And I can't think of anybody to be a better ambassador for this disorder. Knowledge is power, and we need to get the knowledge of NF out to the world. And she's the one that's going to make this happen because she cares so much about other people.
Being the CTF National Ambassador, I'm honored to be able to tell my story, and not just my story, but to tell the kids' stories. I am here to fight for you and with you to raise as much awareness and as many funds as we can to support our cause. And that's something that I am very, very passionate about.
Good morning, my name is Jennifer Janis. I'm a neuropsychologist at Children's Hospital Colorado, and we'll be talking today about the impact of NF on families, as well as ways of navigating challenges and building support. I'd like to thank the NF Summit organizers for inviting me to talk today. So I first want to talk about who is family, and I'll talk a lot about the research that looks at chronic illness and other chronic disorders on family. Most of the research focuses on our traditional ideas of family, so parents, children's, husbands, wives, partners. But we know that family can really consist of a lot of other people, right? So we like to think of define family as people who support and care for each other on a regular basis. So as we talk, I might be talking about research that is focusing on parents or husbands or wives, but I want you to think about who's in your family and who are the important people that this might apply to in your circle. I also want to emphasize that every family is different and must find their own ways. And this is actually a quote from one of the articles that I'll talk about a little later that asked young adults about their experiences with NF. And I also think that is important too. So I'm going to be talking about some general strategies, what the research tells us, but every family is different and every family is going to have to find what works for them. And every individual with NF is different, as you all know. These are some quotes from the article that asked, again, young adults about their experiences with NF, and I just think these are so important to think about, whereas one person said, you know, I don't think about NF very much. Everyday life goes on, regardless of whether I have NF or not, doesn't really impact me on a day-to-day basis. And somebody else said, I think about NF all the time. And so I think it's important as we talk about these strategies, again, is how do you make them individualized for your experiences and your family's experiences? So let's talk about what NF can impact, and you guys know a lot of this information, but I'd like to just sort of start with us thinking broadly about NF as a whole. So we know that NF can impact health. People with NF experience pain and headaches, fatigue. People with NF2 have hearing loss, and people with NF have to undergo a lot of medical appointments and medical procedures that impact their day-to-day life. We also know that NF can affect cognitive functioning in terms of things like executive functioning difficulties, which are problems with things like planning and organization and problem solving. Attention problems are highly seen in people with NF, as are learning disabilities and different types of learning disorders. NF can also affect behavioral functioning. So we know that there's a higher rate of ADHD among individuals with NF. And I was just here at the end of the discussion, Amanda's talk before mine, and I heard a lot of people talking about the impact of anxiety and depression on their lives. And then we also know that NF can impact social functioning. So when we ask people with NF about how they feel socially, many people report feeling socially isolated. Interestingly, I'm referencing this article a lot that talked to young adults because it had a lot of really interesting information in it. And the people in the article who were interviewed were between the ages of 18 and 30, and they reported still having an impact of being bullied as kids when they were still young adults, and how that really still interfered with their ability to put themselves out there socially and take those social risks. And then we also know that there's a higher incidence of autism spectrum disorder in individuals with NF, which can also impact social functioning. So we know we have these isolated areas of weakness, but we also know that there's a lot of impact between those as well, right? Or interaction between them. So maybe you have a lot of pain or a lot of headaches, which then prevents you from going into social activities, right? Or maybe you have some executive functioning weaknesses, which then might impact your work functioning. And so these things aren't just in isolation. There's a lot of impact and cross impact between them all, which then we know affects global quality of life. And quality of life is a way we think about a person's well-being. So how well are you doing in things like your job, socially, physically? And we know when we look at the research of individuals with NF1, NF2, both report lower quality of life in things like cognition, social, and emotional functioning. And we also know that things like severity of illness and visibility of illness also lowers quality of life as well. So I'm going to talk first about just sort of generally, and this is just from a lot of information and research that looks at the impact of chronic illness or chronic disorders, just different kinds of disorders, not necessarily NF. But how do these impact family relationships? One of the bigger ones is the impact that a disorder can have on family roles. So sometimes people may unexpectedly be a caregiver, right? So you may have to care for your sibling, a grandparent may have to care for a grandchild. So there's disruption in sort of what the expectation might be for people's roles in the family. The other piece that the research highlights is the emotional impact, and there are a lot of different emotions one can have around this, right? You can feel guilt, you can feel angry, worried, frustrated, embarrassed, grief, loss. All these kinds of things are emotions that we see across different disorders. And then we know that there's a lot of strain on the relationships and families that are impacted by chronic disorders. So when you read the research, there's a lot of report of arguments and tension, a lack of understanding. My husband or wife just doesn't understand what it's like to have NF or another disorder. There might be differences in beliefs or outlooks. So one parent may think the child should have special ed services, another parent may think that they maybe shouldn't have special ed services. So there's some disagreement in how to treat or how to address some of the symptoms. In general, families report having less time to spend together because a lot of time is spent in medical appointments and doing other things. And there's a high report of caregiver burnout. Lots of times, as we look at some of the research, a lot of the caregiving falls on sometimes more one person than someone else, which then leads that person to becoming more stressed and more burnt out over time. So as I move into talking more specifically about kind of the individual relationships with families, we want to think about what those relationships are, because it's a family, but then there's lots of sub-relationships that go into that, right? So first we want to think about the individual. So how are we going to promote the adaptation of that individual? If we can work on their mental health, which I know Amanda talked a lot about before me, how is that going to positively impact the family system as a whole? Then we want to think about the partner relationships, so the husband, wife, boyfriend, girlfriend of the person with NF. The parent or caregiver relationship, how does that relationship work? And then sibling relationships, which are also really important. And then we want to think about how do all those different relationships, again, interact with each other to impact family functioning as a whole. Okay. So I'm going to talk about each of those individually. First, I'm going to talk about kind of the impact on family relationships. I know there's a lot of information on this slide. This information, there's two really great articles. One I've already referenced a bunch of times about looking at young adult perceptions of NF, and there's another one that surveyed older adults with NF and asked about their worries and concerns. And these are a lot of the themes that come up. So the themes are in kind of physical concerns, cognitive concerns, emotional concerns. Oops, sorry, trying to. So there's one of the biggest concerns that people talk about in terms of NF that adults report are these concerns for the future or the unknown, right? NF is a very unpredictable disease. You don't know if the symptoms you have now might be the same a year from now. And so people really talked a lot about that as one of the bigger concerns or worries that they have as an adult or an individual with NF. They also reported concerns about limitations in their daily life. I'm sorry, I have notes on the side here and I'm trying to figure out how to scroll them. Sorry. Okay, I will just wing it. There we go. Okay. The other big concern is limitations in daily life. And so a lot of people talk about concerns about work. So will their employer understand their difficulties? Will understand things like the impact that their fatigue or headaches might have on their work or in their daily life? People reported a lot of concerns about independence too. And so are they going to have to rely on family members to take care of them? Do they need help with planning, like housework, organization, things like that? A lot of concerns also about family planning, how to address that with partners, how to talk about that. Concerns about limited access to care. I know yesterday there was the presentation about some of the adult clinics, and they showed the map of where different NFCN clinics are. And as someone who's in Colorado, I can attest to the fact that we are surrounded by states that don't have a lot of NF clinic care, right? So these kind of middle of the West states are a little bit uncovered. And then thinking about impact on relationships, concerns about cognition and mental health concerns, and all of these can result in some low self-esteem and concerns about yourself. We also know that symptom visibility can have an impact. I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to take a minute. Can someone help me with my notes on the side? Well, I can see them, but only some of them. Yeah, I'm still not, how do I? Oh, I can't scroll? Oh, you scroll, oh, got it. Sorry, everyone. This is, it's taxing my executive functioning skills here today. Okay, so limitations in daily life. Okay, where am I now? Sorry. We can scroll down a little bit. Down, down, down. Okay, thank you. Impact on the individual, we know symptom visibility impacts mental health of the individual, and also impact on the parents. And this is some interesting research that looks at parents, and no offense to any dads out there, when we look at the research, the mothers report much, much higher stress than dads do, mothers of kids with chronic illnesses. And we see that the visibility and severity of the child's symptoms really impact the family as well. So families who have kids who are more affected report more distress, more family conflict, less family time spent together. So I want to move from talking about the individual to talking about parents. And so I found this in another article about looking at more broad chronic disorders, and I just sort of love this quote. This is from a parent saying parents with kids with chronic illnesses aren't just parents, right? They're care coordinators, they're medical experts, they're systems advocates, they're personal ambassadors, they're their kids' representatives. And so just reading that list makes me exhausted, right? So all the things that you have to do as a parent beyond just parenting when you have a child with a chronic illness. The other thing that comes with that is that parents and caregivers are usually the gatekeepers of information, right? So they're the ones that have all that information about your child's medical history, about their functioning, about their educational history. And then you have to be the one to figure out, how am I disclosing that? Who am I disclosing it to? In what settings am I going to do this? Which also creates a lot of additional stress for parents. Okay, again, this is going to be kind of a busy slide, but I want to kind of have the individual and the parent information side by side. So there was an article done by Bark who asked parents about their experiences caring for a child with NF, and three main themes emerged. One was sort of the uncertainty of the diagnosis and this idea of like, when is the other shoe going to drop, right? So you're kind of always living with this chronic stress of what's going to be happening next. The second is the impact of appearance, so managing other people's questions. You're out at the pool, you're in the store, what are people going to say? And also having the concerns for your own child's self-esteem, and parents talked about how, my child doesn't want to wear certain shirts because their tumors are more visible when they wear that, and being sensitive to those kinds of things. And then the third one was other people's understanding of NF. And people who are newly diagnosed report a lot of overwhelm at initial diagnosis. It's too much information, it's too much for them to take in. And then people talk a lot about sort of this diagnostic odyssey that they've gone through, right? So they saw a lot of professionals who didn't know about NF, and it took them a long time to get to their NF diagnosis. And then they talk about, in terms of understanding, schools also not understanding too as being a big area of stress. The other issue that parents talk a lot about is this change in expectations. And one big piece of that is that they talk about sort of this idea of having a persisting coordinating role. And another theme as we go through my talk will be thinking about, as we have kids, we sort of expect them to do things at certain ages, right? So we expect kids, once they reach college age or young adulthood, to kind of be more independent and go out there in the world. And many times parents of kids with NF feel like they have to maintain this persisting coordinating role, helping with appointments or social organizations and things like that. And then also concerned about a child potentially having more limitations as an adult, and who's going to help care for that person when they are no longer around. It's interesting, the research that looked at some of this reported that parents after diagnosis reported an improved strength in their relationship. So they felt that their relationship was maybe stronger in some respects. They felt like a team with their partner, but they also reported a decline in the quality of their relationship. So they felt that they weren't as emotionally in touch with their partner. A lot of people reported reports on impact on intimacy with their partner. And so while there is some positives or some benefits of the relationship, there's clearly some negatives as well. Interestingly, the majority said they would do couples counseling, but almost 75% of the people said they were not offered any sort of therapy or couples counseling after their diagnosis, which for those of us who work clinically is an important message. And then parents who have NF1 also reported a lot of the impact of their own symptoms on their interaction with their children. So they report that sometimes they might just be too tired to play with their kids or be in too much pain, and how they feel like that impacts the quality of their relationship with their kids. Okay, let's talk a little about the impact on partners. So one of the themes is sort of this shift in the balance of the relationship. So lots of times someone might be the wage earner, someone might be the caregiver, and then someone else might get sick, and those boundaries and those roles shift, which can be stressful in a partnership. Lots of people, and I meant to start with this and forgot, a lot of people submitted questions and thoughts on the Whova app before my talk, which I really appreciate. And a lot of the two main themes in those questions were difficulty of someone else understanding NF symptoms, and how do I talk about NF to other people? And I think this is a big one for family relationships, is how do people understand what I'm going through? The chronic illness literature in general talks about families sometimes feeling obligated to care, right? So they might feel some resentment sometimes even, or feel that this is impacting their own life, and then sometimes, or many times, then feeling guilt about having those feelings. And some of the research talks about double caring parents. So the unaffected parent who maybe has to care for an affected partner and an affected child, and the strain and burden that can go with that. We talked a little about kind of problems emotionally staying in touch, and then partners talk a lot about this fear for the future, fear for what is going to happen to their partner, how are people going to help care for their partner. And the research in general shows that partners of people with chronic illness also have lower quality of life. Let me talk a little bit about siblings. And I want to give a little plug. There's a poster out there. I got to get my old lady glasses on. Wait a second so I can see what I wrote down. Alexion has poster number 101 out there in the poster session, which is looking at a study they did of siblings of kids with all kinds of rare diseases, so not just NF. And I think it's really sort of interesting data that they gathered is that 91% of the siblings said that their siblings' chronic illness affected their own education. Which I think is something we don't think about a lot. And lots of times siblings have to come to medical appointments. I see this a lot again in Colorado. People drive pretty long distances to come see us in Colorado. And sometimes there's no choice but to bring the sibling with them. And so kids miss school, miss their own things because of that. 50% of the siblings said that they were considered caregivers of their ill sibling. 52% said they felt they received no support. And 72% said that it negatively affected their mental health, having a sibling with a chronic illness. So sometimes I feel like siblings get a little bit of the short end of the stick here, right? Sometimes families understandably have to be really focused on one child's needs. And so lots of times kids feel left out, left in the dark because they don't know what's going on, which leads to a lot of anxiety and unease. They might feel less special than the other child. They also, lots of times, as this survey shows, have increased expectations for things that maybe they shouldn't be doing at that age, right? They're expected to be more mature. They're expected to do more to help out around the house, which can lead to lots of negative emotions, like jealousy, guilt, fear, all these kinds of things. Then I just want to briefly talk about the impact on family systems, right? So we have kind of these relationships, and then we think about how does this affect the family as a whole or the family as a system? So we know that having a chronic disorder has a big financial burden. Lots of times people are maybe having to pay out of pocket, don't have good insurance, cost of treatments, changes they might have to make to their home. If someone, for example, is in a wheelchair, you may have to make modifications to your house for that. You might have to miss work to provide care or to care for or to go to doctor's appointments, and you may have to work more to cover expenses. So families may have to have 2-3 jobs to do this. It affects education of kids and the work life of the parents. So we know this is super unpredictable. So how well does your boss handle when you have to call in at the last minute because you're ill or your child is ill? Again, hospital appointments, and then just disruption at work. So you might be late because maybe your child has autism or ADHD and has a hard time getting out of the house in the morning to go to school. Or maybe your kid calls you a lot at work because they have high anxiety. And so how does your workplace deal with that? And then it affects leisure and social time together as a family. Given the financial impact, sometimes there's lack of money, time, support to take vacations, or maybe you can't take the vacations that you want to take. Physical difficulties may also limit social interactions. And one of the quotes from one of the articles, a mom said, "My life is just so different that my friends just sort of drifted away." And so how do you keep up that social support? Okay. We also know that family history of NF is a little bit different than some other chronic disorders because there is a genetic component, and that has its own sort of different stresses. We see that in families where there's not a family history of NF. Again, this is all very new, very stressful information. Many families report being overwhelmed by this and sort of not understanding what that family member is going through. In families who do have a family history, it's maybe more familiar. Diagnosis may happen earlier, but we do see, especially among mothers, lots of reports of guilt of transmitting the disorder on, struggles with their own symptoms and struggles with their own history, and how their family maybe dealt with NF can also impact how their nuclear family is adjusting. So when we think about family adjustment, this is sort of a family systems perspective. So when we think about you have a family, right, and a family wants to maintain balance. So you have sort of these resources on one end, so the things that kind of help you cope, the things in your community, and then you have these stressors and strains and daily hassles on the other end. And the idea is always that you want a balance between that, right? And so things pop up in life, you increase your resources, it balances out. And so I want to just use kind of an example of what happens with families with NF. And so let's take this family adaptation. And this is a family that has lots of resources. They really understand NF, they have good social support, they have good health care, and they have everyday demands like everyone else. And they're doing pretty well, right? And then maybe they have everyday stressors. So you have a fight with your boss at work, you get a fender bender. This is stuff that other families, that everyone is dealing with. But in addition to that, families with NF have all these other things. So maybe your child has difficulty getting medications that we need. You know, there's been a shortage of some ADHD medications. I know some of the families I work with have had a hard time getting medications for their kids. Maybe a new medical problem rises. Maybe there's more school difficulties or new school difficulties for your kids. And so what ends up happening is the research talks about how these stressors really pile up and pile on for families with chronic illness, which then disrupts the balance, right? And so suddenly the resources that you have are no longer helping you to cope with all these new stressors and new difficulties. And so what we want to think about is what are the plans and the strategies and things that we can give you to help you maintain that balance. So what do we know affects individual adjustment? So these are the three top things when we look at just chronic disorders in general that help individuals to cope: self-esteem, self-efficacy, and self-mastery. So self-esteem is really confidence in yourself, right? So that is sort of feeling your own self-worth. I am confident in who I am and what I can do. Self-efficacy is your belief in your ability to act to achieve a goal. So I know that I have the skills to act and do things to get the goal that I put out there for myself. And then self-mastery is your ability to recognize that you can take control and manage yourself and take responsibility for your own life, that things don't just happen to you, right? So I am the master of my own domain, if anyone remembers the old Seinfeld episodes. Okay, in NF, what are the things that we see are important in NF specifically? So we see communication, and I'm going to talk about this a lot in respects to disclosure and how we talk about NF. Social support. You know what, this is not the most recent version of my slides. Okay, so there should be a fourth one on there, which is knowledge. Knowledge, so communication, social support, and personality factors are the top four there. Okay, I know the video that played right before I started talking, someone said this: knowledge is power, and I know it sounds cliche, but it's really true. Having knowledge makes you powerful, and it makes you be able to have that self-mastery and makes you able to sort of have all those things that you need to take control of what you do. And this, I've seen this pop up multiple places in other talks as well, but I'm just going to give another plug for all these amazing resources that the Children's Tumor Foundation has. They have them by diagnosis, for parents, for individuals, and they're really amazing. So when we think about talking about NF, and this was something, again, that came up a lot, the things that we want to think, that people usually think about is like, who am I going to tell, when am I going to tell, and how am I going to tell? And again, this is an older version of my talk, and the newer version I had the fourth, which is what am I going to tell, right? So when we think about who am I going to tell, when we look at sort of chronic disorders in general, the people that are usually told or that people decide to disclose to are usually employers, teachers, partners, and close friends. But really the thing is you can tell whoever you want, right? And so when you look at this, when you look at some of these articles, that some people say like, well, one quote was like, well, I tell everyone that I have NF. I mean, maybe not the minute I meet them was sort of their quote, but it's on my Facebook page. It's sort of everywhere that I have NF. And so it's really a personal preference. Usually we recommend the when of telling is sort of early on and having ongoing conversations. So if you're dating someone, maybe not on the first date, but earlier on in the relationship is usually recommended so that things don't start to become big and secretive. We want things to sort of be out there in the open. And we think about finding a time when you can connect and focus on things. So the how is the big one now. So let's talk about how we sort of think about talking about NF. So when you look at surveys that people do with individuals who have NF, the biggest concern about disclosing the diagnosis is being viewed as disabled, right? So you want to tell people, but you don't want them to view you as negatively, right? Is this or having a disability? So part of it, I think, is what do you want them to know, which gets along to why are you disclosing this information? Are you disclosing it because it's impacting your work? So what are the important things for this person to know? We also think about starting conversations with something that is relevant to you, right? So you may have noticed that I have these spots or these bumps, or you may have noticed that sometimes I forget when you tell me where we're gonna meet or what we're gonna do this afternoon. And this can lead into more easily some conversations about that. And then keeping the conversation ongoing. None of these discussions are gonna be a one-time discussion, they're gonna be ongoing. One of the things that I think is important, and this is really good anxiety management, because I think a lot of this is anxiety-based, right? We're worried about what other people are gonna think or say when we disclose information. And so one main anxiety strategy is coming up with a script, right? So what is sort of your elevator pitch for what NF is or what NF means to you? And so coming up with a 2-sentence, 3-sentence sort of description of what this is. So when someone says, what's NF? Or why do you have bumps on your arm? You have something immediately that comes to mind that you can say. That's short, sweet, and simple, right? The CTF, because they're amazing, has done some of this for us. So in one of their handbooks, and I'll be honest, I forget exactly which one because I looked through so many of them, has this sort of sample letter of how to disclose NF to family and friends. And this is, I think, a really nice model of ways to do this. So the other thing that people talked a lot about or had questions about in the Whova app was how do I have other people understand my NF experience? And I think some of the suggestions were great, and a lot of the suggestions revolved around these CTF materials and giving partners or other people these CTF materials. I do think, while I love all the materials and think they're amazing, there is a lot of information in those materials, right? And I think they can be overwhelming too. And not all of those symptoms in those materials might apply to you as an individual. So I think sometimes it's helpful to think, what are the top 3 things that affect me, right? And those, again, are the top 3 things if someone asks me or helping my partner understand my experience, those are the top 3 things that I'm gonna talk about. I think you can also use CTF materials more specifically. And so this is actually from the NF Parent Guidebook, which talks about all the symptoms that you see with NF1, right? And there's a lot, and you may not have all of these. But maybe as you talk with your partner, you highlight the ones that are most important to you or that you feel like impact you the most. It helps take that big, overwhelming information and narrow it down and make it more relevant to you and your partner. Okay, discussing NF with children. Disclosure is a big, big area of topic in chronic disorders and chronic illness. And how do you disclose? Do you disclose? And so a survey of parents of kids with NF, 70% of the parents decided to disclose the diagnosis to their child, 30% did not. There is a strong relationship, probably not surprisingly, between severity and decision to disclose. So usually kids who had more significant or severe symptoms, their parents chose to disclose to them. Kids with more mild symptoms were usually the families where parents did not disclose. The parent concerns, when we ask them, well, what are you concerned about disclosure? The big one is between sort of this conflict between informing your child and wanting to protect them, right? And so you want to let the child know what's going on, but there's lots of scary stuff that can go along with NF, and so you might want to protect them from some of those things. Lots of parents just struggle to explain NF, and how do I even explain that to my child, and how do I bring up things that are really hard to talk about, like reproduction? Some parents talk about the struggles again with their own diagnosis and maybe how their parents did or didn't talk about it with them and how that's impacting their ability to disclose to their child. And for families that chose not to disclose, it was usually because of a fear of a negative impact on that child's kind of approach to life or their determination to succeed, and sort of this idea that they wouldn't want them to think, well, I can't do this because I have NF. They don't want that to sort of be in their child's mind. And sort of the family history of NF impacts this as well. So when we look at the research over time, we know that there's been sort of what they call a generational shift, where these sort of newer generations are more open and able to talk to their kids about NF, and I think that has to also do with more resources and a better understanding that we have of NF now than we did 20, 50 years ago. So what are recommendations for talking with kids? The first always is to start discussions early. We usually think, again, that we don't want this to be something that kids hear about for the first time when they're 17 years old. We want to think this is something that's a part of their life, part of ongoing family discussions. At age developmental levels, but something that they know the words, they know what this means. We want to make sure that it's simple. We want to use concrete language and give small amounts of information at a time. Things will get complex later on, but we can start with very simple conversations. We always want to check for understanding. I mean, it's remarkable how many times I see with kids that I'm working with or my own kids where I'll say something and it's completely not what I meant, what my kid picked up from that, right? So you want to check their own understanding of what they're picking up from what you're telling them. And we want to normalize their feelings, right? So they may feel super sad about it. They may not have a lot of feelings about it right now because they might not really know what it means. And so just normalize whatever the kids are feeling and making the conversations informal, right? And so you may have a first discussion about diagnosis and a more like, let's sit down and talk about this, but maybe you talk about it while you're driving in the car or cooking dinner or doing other activities as well. And I think also going at your child's pace is important. Some kids are going to want a lot of information. Some kids are just not going to want to talk about it too much, and taking cues from them. Of course, considering their age and developmental level is important, and keeping conversations ongoing. The other important thing is learning together, and I think is an important lesson for us as parents, no matter what, is to sort of say, I don't know. We want to give our kids answers to questions, to every question they might have, but we might not always know those answers. And so feeling like, well, let's kind of learn together. Let's look it up on CTF. Let's keep a list going for your doctor's appointments so that we can find this information together. And really encouraging your child to participate in medical appointments, I think, is important too. Sometimes I think, we do our best in medical appointments to make sure we're including the kid all the time, but sometimes you are busy or behind in your clinic and you want to get through information quickly, and so you might focus more on the parent, but really making sure to empower your child to feel a part of those medical appointments. And again, my ongoing plug for CTF materials. So there's a lot of materials, excuse me, I'm very allergic to something here in Arizona. There's a lot of materials geared towards kids on the CTF website. So we have Moxie and Sparks, Explain NF1, these different kind of comic book things. In the middle there is an example from the parent guidebook where it has activities you can do with your child, so some ideas for things to do there. And this is a new book that's coming out, which I'm super excited about because I was given the opportunity to collaborate a little bit on this book. And this is more of a book for younger kids. It's a picture book. About cafe au lait spots, the story of my special spots. And the thing that I love the most about this book is all of these pictures were painted with coffee. Isn't that cool? Yeah. So this book will be coming out soon, so keep an eye out for it on the CTF website. Okay, there is not a lot of research on this. I thought there would be more, quite honestly. How do you talk to NF about with your employers and with teachers? And I think the biggest thing is to come into those meetings with confidence, right? And this is the knowledge is power. You're the expert. You're the expert on you. You're the expert on NF. Be open and direct about your needs or your child's needs, and set up a very specific meeting time to discuss, right? So we're not just gonna do this in the hallway over the water cooler, we're gonna have a meeting to discuss this. And I think it is important to bring written notes to keep reminding yourself of what you wanna talk about and be able to keep on topic that way. Again, there's my CTF materials popping in. There are specific ones for teachers about learning disabilities, about NF in general, that I think are important to help. Okay, so now I'm gonna move into talking about how do we promote adjustment in all those areas, individuals, partners, families, siblings, okay. So we talked about knowledge already. You're the expert. We talked about communication. You get to decide what you wanna disclose and who you wanna tell. Let's talk about social support. This comes up as a huge factor of positive adjustment in individuals with NF. In one of the articles, they talked about when they asked people what limits the impact of NF on your life, the three main things were, well, the two in the social domain were having a social group, having a social system, and working. People who have social groups obviously have a lot of support that way, and a lot of people reported that their social groups are from more organized settings, so things like support groups or other people they met through conferences like this. And then people who work, even with part-time jobs, reported that it just kind of took their mind off their NF. They had other things to focus on, and they reported less depression and less anxiety. People also reported a lot of benefit from sort of technology that we have nowadays, that it's easier to keep in touch with people through texts and social media and those kinds of things, which really help their support group. And then when we look at certain personality characteristics of people with NF who are coping maybe better with their disease, the things that pop up are being optimistic, being creative with solutions for things in their life, having more stamina, and having more self-confidence. And one of the things that the broader research looks at is the idea of cognitive mediation, or focusing on what you can do rather than what you can't do. And this gets into that idea of self-mastery that we talked about in the beginning. If I feel like I can do something instead of things that are happening to me. When we think about personality characteristics, the way that we promote those are really through more therapeutic kinds of interventions, right? And I know I heard Amanda talking a little bit about this when I walked in before, but psychotherapy can be helpful for things like anxiety, depression, social functioning. There are specific pain psychologists to help with that. We looked at there have been some interventions that have looked at and have been developed specifically for people with NF. One is the Relaxation Response Resiliency Program. This looked at providing strategies for relaxation, so mindfulness and meditation, things like that, and then looked at how people kind of respond to stress and ways to promote their resiliency, hence the name Relaxation Response and Resiliency. And people who were in this program did report improvements in pain intensity and anxiety and physical quality of life. Another therapy that has been looked at in individuals with NF is acceptance and commitment therapy. This was a program that was geared towards adolescents who have pain and young adults, and their parents were included in this as well. And this focused on not so much how do I control my pain, but how do I accept my pain, and how do I find ways to cope and deal with that. And this program resulted in significant declines in pain interference as reported by their participants. And then there's another program that's ongoing now called the Program for Education and Enrichment of Relational Skills, or PEERS. And this is for adolescents, again, and their parents, which is more focused specifically on social skills. This program, before being kind of modified for the NF kids, has been used in kids with ADHD and autism, which we know have some relationship to some of the social struggles that adolescents with NF might have. But they've kind of focused it in more on some of the more specific things that folks with NF might be experiencing. And there was improvement in parent-reported social emotional skills and social knowledge after participating in this program. So the nice thing about the three bottom therapies is that these are therapies that have a lot of evidence and research behind them in other populations that researchers have taken and then modified for folks with NF. And that has been really important because we know that the therapy works, and then we kind of take it and make it appropriate for some of the struggles and challenges that individuals with NF are facing. Okay. These are a list of just the protective factors that contribute to resiliency in families. So this is what we want to, this is what the research says helps, right? And I can look at this list and name about 7 things that my family doesn't necessarily do well, right? And so don't think that you have to be able to do all these things. But these are the things that when we look at kind of good family functioning, this is what promotes adaptation. Working as a team, feeling like you're on the same page, building on your family's strengths, having very clear expectations of who's doing what and communicating that effectively, who is taking what roles in the family, being able to balance demands of time and work and play and all those kinds of things, and having supportive social networks. So this is a quote from one of the articles of Adults with NF: "Lean on others, it will lighten the load." And I think the importance of social support cannot be minimized, and I feel like I keep saying this over and over again. And people really talked about having to find the right kind of support, right? And so other families may not experience what you're going through, and it may be support groups, it may be Children's Tumor Foundation things, or it might be families who are having other kinds of chronic illnesses, or kids who are, children who have other kinds of disabilities. So maybe exploring other hospital groups or other things like that in your area can be helpful. Open and clear communication where everyone is involved, and this is important too, giving kids a voice, giving everyone in the family a voice to their own concerns. Personal well-being, I think, relates a lot to Amanda's talk before me, and this is another quote, that it's a marathon, not a sprint. So you really have to make sure that you're taking care of yourself in all of this too, right? Whether you're the parent or the individual with NF or the child, you have to make sure that you are taking care of yourself to do this for the long term, and balancing those demands, knowing how to say no or not right now, we can do this later. And then the idea of active coping strategies. So some of the research looks at active coping strategies versus passive coping strategies. And active coping strategies are those efforts where you're really trying to change either the source of the stress or your reaction to it. Now, lots of times we can't change the source of the stress, right? We can't change that maybe I have to go to lots of doctor's appointments, or we can't change that I feel stressed about finances. But I can maybe change my reaction to it, and that is when we think about active coping strategies. And that's where we start to think about how can we intervene therapeutically to improve that active coping. So one is family therapy, which focuses on family systems and how families relate to each other. Stacey Martin at the NIH did a clinical trial looking at an internet support group for parents of children with NF, and found that it was really beneficial in terms of kind of the process. So parents found that it was helpful to share information with other people, get information from other people and share emotions, as well as kind of the content, that parents found a lot of support in getting information about resources, medical information, school information. Hasn't been done in NF, but there's a therapy that looks at kind of family conversations or having health promoting communications. These interventions are usually led by a nurse or a medical professional, and are kind of use a lot of reflective listening strategies. So they listen to what the families are talking about and reflect back on what they hear their concerns are and ways to cope and adjust with that. And then another, again, hasn't been trialed in NF, but it's called Mastering Each New Direction, or the MEND program, where you're going to improve coping and stress by, it looks at sort of multiple therapies at once. So the families do individual therapy, family therapy, multifamily therapy, where you're working with other families, and peer counseling and peer support as well, to look at kind of all aspects of that from a therapeutic perspective. Okay, I want to talk about how do we promote adjustment as a couple. So a lot of, again, people in the Whova app talked about how do I talk to my partners about this, or how do we help? And the first is just kind of open and respectful communication. It's important, I think, to be compassionate of other people's feelings. We might not always understand why someone is feeling that way, but we can be compassionate about that person having that feeling. We want to try to understand others' perspectives, and we also want to kind of give permission for people to have a bad day, right? So some days might just really stink, and that's okay, and sort of allow that. There's a lot of talk in the research about being on the same page with things and feeling like a team and making joint decisions. And this gets to kind of problem solving as a couple, but without blaming, right? So, well, you want to do this, but I want to do this, and your idea is dumb, and I did all the research, so my idea makes sense. And I think that gets to how do we make these joint decisions together? And I think lots of times in families, people get assigned different roles, which works, right? And so my husband is better at some things than I am at other things, but if I'm the person doing all the research in the family, then I also want him to sort of understand that I've looked into a lot of this, and maybe we can look at it together, but I don't want him to just come in and say, well, that's a dumb idea, when I've done all the research behind it. Okay, we want to make time for another. This is really big in any chronic illness research that you look at. One of the quotes from the adult article says, you started as two, and don't forget that. This is especially, I think, important for families who have a child with a chronic illness, is making time, scheduling date nights, those kinds of things, and then expressing gratitude. I think we all forget to do this probably with partners and family members. Thanking people for little things, making sure that you are aware of the things that other people are doing, even small things, and recognizing each other's contributions. Again, an area, when you look at the research, there's not a lot out there. Couples counseling can focus on strengthening relationships. There's a therapeutic intervention called couples coping enhancement training, which looks at what they call dyadic coping, which looks at how do couples cope together. So how do I understand my partner's stress reaction, and how do I respond better to that? So if I know my partner always does this when they're stressed, if they're doing that, I can recognize that and I can intervene. I know how to intervene on my end. And then a lot of people just talk about community support, right? And so this can be the NF community, this can be girlfriends that you go to book club with, it can be anybody, and sometimes you just need to vent a little bit, right? And sometimes just the venting is all you need. You maybe don't need someone to come in and problem solve and help, but who can you just talk to about these things? Okay. I am gonna quickly run through parenting because I am running out of time somehow already. I'm talking too much here. This is from the NF guidebook, and I think I just took this because I think all of these are super important points. It's too small for me to, can someone, I'm sorry, I know you made it smaller, but now I can't read it. I'm sorry. My slide. I don't think I have too many notes anymore, so thank you very much. So you want to learn as much as you can. Knowledge is power. Try not to take your child's issues personally, and I think that's an important one, right? So sometimes I see, like, when my kid does something and says something sort of mean or something to me, I might kind of take that a little personally, but you want to think of where some of those things are coming from. Practicing compassion. Taking a disability perspective doesn't mean that your child is disabled necessarily or can't do things, but just that you want to use that perspective to be sensitive to their needs and their abilities. And trying to remember that parenting is not the cause of anyone's problems, and that's important to keep in mind, but using different parenting strategies can help. So the first is that we want to make sure we're working as a team, right? And so, again, mutual support and shared goals. How do we give your child a voice? Lots of times as parents, we're making decisions, right? But we want kids in an appropriate way, and when appropriate, to be able to voice their own, encourage their own daily decisions. Lots of things that look at family adjustment talk about making sure that the child who has the illness also has expectations in the family, chores, things they have to do just like their siblings have to do to make sure that there's kind of that ongoing routines and rules and priorities just like the other kids in the house have. We want to think about family structure and interactions. Staying organized is really important. A lot of kids with NF have executive functioning problems, and it helps as the parent if we can be organized and help them stay organized. Having a schedule, but also being flexible when change is coming up, being able to handle those kinds of things. Having tolerance, understanding, patience, humor. Humor is big with this, right? And so there's always things that are gonna come up that aren't great, and being able to maintain a sense of humor is really important. Okay, we want to appreciate the cognitive impact of NF. We know that kids with NF do have more learning disabilities, executive functioning problems, ADHD. So we want to focus on effort, focus on improvement, break tasks down for them, help them to get through things, being consistent with routines, and having good communication with their school. We want to help your child cope, right? If you're not coping well, your child's probably not going to cope well. We are the scaffolds for our child's coping, so how are we going to help them do that? Validating their feelings, planning for medical appointments, and helping them to get out there socially and get their own social networks. And then managing behavior, right? This is something every parent is going to struggle with. So consider their developmental level. Your child may be 14, but they may have some difficulties that makes them more like a 5 or 6-year-old child. How are you going to manage behavior in that context? Using appropriate limits, concise and clear expectations, rewards, and reinforcements. So just good behavior management strategies. Siblings I talked a little bit about already. We talked about kind of scaffolding. Your own support helps them support and helps them navigate things. I think giving them a language to talk about NF is important too. So in the beginning, when we talked about disclosure, we talked about having this, what's your 2 or 3 sentences that you can always use to talk about NF. I think it's important to give siblings that as well. So if they're at the pool together or you're not around and someone says, hey, what's going on with your sister? They have a quick and dirty way to explain that as well. Validating their feelings. You might not always understand their feelings, but it's important to validate them. They might be angry about things, they might feel guilty about things, they might feel jealous of their sibling, and understanding and trying to validate those siblings. And involving them in events, making them part of the walk team, making them an important part of what's happening and what's going on. And probably most importantly, making sure that they have special time and feel when they feel like they can have their parents' attention and feel special together. Oh, I'm sorry, that says couple, it should be siblings. Individual therapy is sometimes important for siblings. And then there's a lot of books that are usually focused more kind of on there's some books that look at general chronic illness, like Views from Our Shoes, which are different, they say essays, but they're like little short stories written by siblings about having a sibling with a chronic illness. And then there's other books that talk about having a sibling with autism or ADHD that can be helpful. Okay, I've talked a lot about sort of the challenges that families with NF face. What are the positive effects? And we do see that there's some positive effects. So we see that families with chronic illness or chronic disorder sometimes report having increased closeness, having more family cohesion, feeling that they have a lot of support. While there can be a negative impact on siblings, siblings also report feeling more responsible, independent, more mature than their peers. They have increased empathy and compassion for others, increased resiliency, and many report having an increased sibling bond. And lots of times people report the positive of finding the good in their community and will saying, you know what, I never knew my community had such a big heart. When this happened to my family, my community came in and supported us, and that was just amazing. Okay, lastly, I just want to also talk about, this talked about the family, right, my talk. If we have the individual and the family, that's also not in isolation, right? So we also always need to think about the immediate environment of what's happening. So friends, coworkers, teachers, classmates. What we consider the indirect environment that also impacts the family. So things like government agencies, healthcare systems, community services that you might be trying to get. And then also what's going on in our culture, society. So what are views on disabilities? What are norms that are going on? What are the values of our culture? And so while we can think about how to promote adjustment within the family, we also need to think about that in the larger system and how these things interact with each other. These are references of some of the articles. I'm not going to go over them, but I know this is being recorded, so if people wanted to stop this and read some of these articles yourself, here's the references. Okay, thank you very much for your time, and any questions or discussion. According to my time, I have 3 minutes and 46 seconds. So I apologize. I meant to have about 15 minutes. I'm not sure. I talked longer than usual.
Here we go. Maybe all the questions are in the end.
Yeah.
Well, just more of a comment. My daughter has NF2, and I'm just wondering why you made this more specific to NF1, because I find it's still very applicable to kids with, and caregivers with NF2 as well.
It is, and I think you're right. Most of the research has been done with NF1, which is why. So when look through the research, virtually all has been done with NF1, but I think a lot of these are just good strategies for really NF1, NF2, any sort of chronic disorder, but yes, that's wise because most of the research is NF1.
Oh, okay. Do you have one too? Yeah.
Do you know of any resources like you showed up there about like an online, maybe family circle therapy that we can join?
You know, it's interesting. I actually reached out to some to the CTF to ask about that, and it seems like right now there are not a lot of online resources specific to NF. I know at the end of the talk before me, I don't know if anyone was in here, I went to write down the website and forgot. It was someone who was at Mass General was reporting kind of an 8-week program that they have. But I think there are a lot of different online therapeutic resources now, especially since COVID. And so I think contacting local hospitals and seeing what kind of online support they have can be helpful. So you don't necessarily need to sort of live within the vicinity of hospitals anymore. A lot of kind of their mental health services can now be done online.
Thank you for this. When we were preparing to come to the summit and I was looking at the agenda, this was like the session that I knew our family needed the most, so thank you so much. My question, our son is he's the first in our family to have NF, and he's 5. And so we're kind of just now in our journey kind of realizing the, attention we need to pay to like how we have coped and how we do cope as a family. So I was really interested, we were really interested when you commented on the fact that 75% of families aren't offered like the counseling therapy like right after a diagnosis, which to us, we definitely were not offered that, but that insinuates that maybe some clinics are offering that to parents after a diagnosis, and I'm curious if you could speak to that. And then one other specific therapy that you called out was the therapy for families that's kind of moderated by a healthcare provider, which I thought might be very helpful for our families. So anyway, I know you can't speak to our hospital, but in general, what do you see for NF clinics, and what kind of services might we ask about that might be available?
I'll be honest, this is a really area that I don't think we do a good job with, right? In that thing where that people said, 75% of them were not offered couples counseling, and I don't know this because the article doesn't say, but my guess is the other 25% are given a list of here's people you can call in case you decide you want to get couples counseling, right? I think there's very few clinics that are doing ongoing intervention for families with NF. And as I said, I think this is an area we don't do well within our own NF clinic. We refer families to our Pediatric Mental Health Institute within the Children's Hospital, or for adults to the resources at the University Hospital, which is next door to us, but none of those are specific to NF. Those are just sort of general therapy interventions to help people cope with what they're going through. So I'll be honest, I don't think we're doing a good job with this. And I think that idea of those health promoting conversations is a great one, and I would love to see someone do an intervention on that with families with NF. And I think, given that we have the Clinic Trials Network, it's really an open way to do that.
Sorry, we have to wrap up because we have to get ready for the next session.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.